In Australia, they've taken it to the next level. Overnight, lawmakers are passing sweeping laws threatening fines, maybe even jail time for executives if sites don't remove what's being defined as, quote, abhorrent violent material from their sites. So what's the impact, and could there ever be a similar push stateside? Let's talk about it with Satya Marar, a Young Voices contributor, up late with me on the Final Five from Sydney, Australia, where it's the middle of the afternoon. Thanks for joining me tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Explain this to me. So this law was passed. This came down overnight, and they're saying this involves abhorrent violent material. I mean, how do they define that? How do they go about enforcing that sort of thing?
Well, they've given us about 5 or 6 different classes of material. This includes footage of tortures, murders, rapes, kidnappings, and terror attacks. But that itself raises huge problems. For example, because the word torture doesn't include a clarification about consent, it could technically prohibit, BDSM pornography rather than terror attacks and the kind of thing it's actually meant to prohibit. Content has to be taken down expeditiously. The word expeditious is not defined either. So that will actually need to go to court for a jury or a judge to determine whether a company acted quickly enough. Now, Facebook took about 3 hours to take down video of the New Zealand terror attack, which is what prompted this law. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable time frame, though that apparently isn't good enough. It's a time frame that a company like Facebook with billions of dollars in resources and tons of moderation staff take to deal with this sort of complaint. So you can just imagine what the impact will be for a smaller website, for an individual service provider, because the penalties are quite severe.
So as we see all this play out, and I'm glad you mentioned about New Zealand, because that was really, you saw a lot of laws passed right after New Zealand. A lot of people paid attention to the sweeping changes to gun laws in the country. We know that the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, came out and said, this was going to be a first priority for her. Are you surprised that something like this moved so quickly in Australia?
I'm not actually surprised at all, because our governments have a massive tendency to overreact, to try and appear tough on terror. We have an election coming up in a month's time. And what's interesting is the Liberal Party, who are the center-right party, the equivalent of the Libertarians here, the Republicans here, are in government, and they push this through. And the Labour Party, they actually said, we think there are huge issues with this law, but we're still going to pass it, because they don't want to look like they're weak on terror. So whenever an attack happens, you always have a crackdown on civil liberties, often very superficially. There is no evidence.
We saw that with the Patriot Act back in 2001. Hey, I'm curious, as we look at this playing out, and you look at the moves the governments are taking in Australia, in New Zealand, is there, as you look at this, any feasible and any possible way that they might get some ideas stateside, that this might be something that there may be a lawmaker or two that says this is worth taking a look at in the United States?
It's very common for American lawmakers to look at what's happening in other developed countries and to try and replicate that, especially if it makes them look tough on these big companies who are easy targets. So in the European Union, they passed data privacy laws, and now you've got tons of American states trying to copy them. I think the risk in the US is lower because you guys have the First Amendment, which we unfortunately don't have in this country. But the risk is still there. I wouldn't be surprised if you get some Democrat lawmakers, for example, coming out saying, these companies need to do the right thing. They have a license and they're not using it, because that's the kind of stuff that both people on the left and the right in this country are using to try and weaponize this issue for political points.
Before I let you go, any idea if Facebook, if Twitter, if any of these big companies have already decided to challenge the legality of this law?
I don't think they've come out with a public statement yet. We have seen some industry groups, tech experts come out against it. I would expect them to challenge this very soon. And if not, I'd expect them to, regardless of this law, now resort to cracking down very harshly on their own platforms in lieu of any sanction.
I think when you mentioned it was a really good point you made about the New Zealand footage, making it online, because there's really the whole definition of what defines what, and that's going to be a challenge regardless of the country. Satya Marar, a Young Voices contributor, thank you very much. I appreciate your insight tonight.
Thank you.
And we're back after this in the Final Five.